I walked into my historic queen and estate to the sound of my life shattering, literally. The crash of drywall dust coated the air like a heavy, suffocating snow. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heavy suitcase dropping from my hand with a dull thud that went unnoticed by the two men currently dismantling my home. Through the white haze, I watched my father, Brian, and my younger brother, Brandon, swing heavy sledgehammers into the custom glass walls of my library. This room was my sanctuary. I had spent years of my career as a restoration architect bringing this Victorian beauty back to life, brick by agonizing brick. My name is Madison Vance, and I never expected that my life's greatest achievement would be destroyed by my own flesh and blood. And there they were, tearing it down with a casual, terrifying efficiency. Brian did not even stop swinging when he saw me standing there. He just laughed, a sound that grated against the screech of metal on glass, and looked over his shoulder at Brandon. His voice was full of a smug, unearned certainty as he spoke. "She won't kick out a pregnant family, Brandon," he said, wiping a streak of white dust from his forehead. He turned to me then, his eyes cold and devoid of any remorse. "We decided the golden boy needs a nursery for the new baby, Madison. It is about time you contributed something real to this family instead of just hoarding this big house for yourself. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community." My pulse did not even spike. In my line of work, when a structure is compromised, you do not mourn the rubble. You assess the liability. I watched a cloud of plaster dust settle onto my vintage Persian rugs I had saved for 6 months to afford, and realized that my compassion had been a luxury my family had overdrafted for years. This was not a family dispute. It was a structural failure of our basic contract. I did not scream. I did not ask them why they thought they had the right to swing steel into my walls. I had given my father an emergency key for a just-in-case situations, never imagining he would use it to facilitate a home invasion. I simply stepped back into the biting Seattle drizzle, the cold air hitting my face like a necessary slap to wake me up. My hands were as steady as a surgeon's as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I need to report a felony burglary in progress," I said, my voice so calm it sounded clinical even to my own ears. "Two men have broken into my home and are currently destroying the property. I am standing outside. They do not know I have called." I waited by the gate of my queen and estate, watching the red and blue lights begin to bounce off the wet pavement. The patrol cars arrived in a silent, violent burst of color, painting the Seattle fog in shades of emergency. I watched from the sidewalk as officers stormed my front door, guns drawn, their commands cutting through the rhythmic thud of the sledgehammers. "Get on the ground. Hands behind your head. Now." When the officers finally cleared the scene and brought me inside to verify my identity, the air in my library was thick with white powder. It settled in my throat like ash and coated the spines of my rare books. Brian, my father, was on the floor, looking more annoyed than afraid, his hands bound by heavy plastic zip ties. Brandon looked pale, his eyes darting around as the realization hit him that this was not a game he could talk his way out of. "This is a misunderstanding, officer," Brian said, trying to force his voice into that authoritative, boardroom tone he used to control everyone around him. "We are her family. She knows we are here. Madison, tell them to stop this nonsense right now. You are embarrassing yourself." I looked at the officer, then at the man who had shared my DNA but never my values. I did not let my gaze waver. "I do not know these men," I said, the words feeling like a clean, sharp blade. "They have no permission to be on this property. They have caused extensive structural damage to a historic landmark. I want to press charges to the fullest extent of the law." Brian's face turned a deep, bruised purple. He began to snarl, calling me a traitor, an ungrateful child who had forgotten who raised her. I did not listen. I handed the lead officer my deed, my identification, and my flight itinerary from the airport. I was establishing a forensic boundary they could never cross again. "You are under arrest for felony property destruction and breaking and entering," the officer told them. As they were being hauled toward the door, my mother Julie's car screeched into the driveway. She ran up the steps, her voice high and shrill as she screamed my name. "Madison." How could you? They are your father and brother. I looked at her, then at the gaping hole in my library wall where my heritage-listed shelves used to be. The house is mine, Mother. The laws of this city do not have a blood relation clause for burglary. I looked at the officer and pointed at her. Her too. She is the getaway driver. She was clearly an accomplice to the planning. As the police put my mother in the back of a second cruiser, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was not guilt. It was the feeling of a heavy, suffocating weight finally being lifted. I stood in the wreckage of my sanctuary, the cold wind blowing through the hole in my history, and for the first time in 27 years, I felt entirely, terrifyingly free. The house was finally quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was the silence of a structure that had been fundamentally compromised. I walked through the debris of my ruined library, my boots crunching on broken glass and expensive plaster. The cold Seattle wind whistled through the gaping hole in my wall, carrying with it the smell of wet pavement and ruin. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself, but the chill was coming from inside me. I went into my office, the only room the sledgehammers had not reached, and sat at my mahogany desk. I did not waste energy on tears. I treated this betrayal like a blighted elm on a construction site. Isolate, identify, and remove. My hands did not tremble as I opened my laptop. Anger was not loud this time, it was clinical. I pulled up a password-protected spreadsheet I had titled The Brandon Debt. $135,000. That was the number staring back at me in bright, unforgiving red. $135,000 in failed startups that never launched, rent he forgot to pay, and emergency bailouts for crises that were always self-inflicted. I scrolled through the entries, dating back to when I first started my firm. A $3,000 artisanal coffee truck venture that lasted 2 weeks. $12,000 for a crypto investment that went to zero. $5,000 for a rental deposit he forfeited because he thought he was too good for a normal job. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long. I remembered the winter I bought this estate. It was a dilapidated wreck. I spent my nights sanding these Victorian floors until my hands bled and my back felt like it would never straighten again. I spent my weekends hunting for period-correct fixtures in salvage yards while Brian, my father, called this place a money pit. He told me my success as a restoration architect was a temporary fluke, a stroke of luck that I would eventually blow. And yet, every time Brandon needed a bailout, Brian would be the one to call me. He would lean on the very success he refused to acknowledge, demanding that I share my resources because family comes first. I realized then that I had been trapped by the survivor's invisible chain. In my head, I had called it loyalty. In reality, it was the sunk cost fallacy of blood. I had invested so much hope, so much love, and so much capital into my relationship with my brother that walking away felt like admitting total loss. I kept throwing good money after bad, hoping that if I covered just one more crisis, he would finally become the brother I wanted him to be. I was gambling on a relationship that did not exist, playing a slot machine that was rigged to keep me empty while they stayed full. They had not just broken a load-bearing wall today, they had broken the spell. I looked at that total again. $135,000. I was closing the account permanently. The silence of the house did not last. By dawn, my phone began to vibrate against the mahogany desk like a frantic, trapped insect. Brian and Julie had posted bail. I did not need to answer to know the narrative they were already spinning. The notifications flooded my screen in a relentless wave of grainy, black and white ultrasound photos. A fetus, curled and defenseless, was being thrust at me as a weapon of moral leverage. It was a barrage of emotional optics designed to bypass my logic and strike at my perceived guilt. "This is your niece," my mother's text read, the words dripping with a calculated, synthetic grief. She was going to sleep in that room. You threw an unborn child out into the Seattle winter. You are a monster, Madison. How do you sleep at night knowing you put your own father in a cell over some drywall and glass? I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse remaining flat and steady. It was a textbook execution of the weaponized womb. They were using a child that had not even taken its first breath as a human shield, daring me to fire back. They knew that in their distorted version of the world, I was merely a service provider for Brandon's happiness. To them, my estate was not my hard-earned sanctuary, it was a communal asset they had a right to liquidate for the benefit of the golden child. This was the trap of cruel normalization. For years, they had groomed me to believe that Brandon's needs were emergencies, while my boundaries were merely suggestions. They had normalized the inherent belief that my success was a shared family resource. Because I was the strong one, they felt entitled to strip my life of its privacy to cushion Brandon's endless string of failures. Cruelty becomes invisible to the perpetrator when it is disguised as a family obligation. They were not asking for my help, they were demanding my total submission. Brandon sent a direct message shortly after, his tone vibrating with an unearned arrogance. My lawyer says I can sue you for emotional distress. You traumatized Taylor. If anything happens to this baby because of the stress you have caused, that is on your head. Drop the charges and pay the $110,000 for the rest of the nursery remodel and the structural repairs, and we might find it in our hearts to forgive you. The entitlement was breathtaking. I did not answer a single message. I simply screenshotted every text, every photo, and every threat, filing them into the evidence folder. Inside, my screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet, lethal retribution. I treated my house like a crime scene because that is exactly what it was. I hired a forensic structural engineer and called my attorney, Gregory, a man who specialized in the intersection of high-end real estate and financial fraud. The sabotage was dangerous, Madison, the engineer said, stepping into the room and wiping white dust from his clipboard. That wall was load-bearing. If you had not stopped them when you did, the entire second floor could have pancaked into your office. It was not a remodel, it was structural negligence on a criminal level. Gregory didn't look surprised. He had been running a deep dive into the county records while I was busy assessing the physical liability. He slid a laptop toward me, his face a mask of professional neutrality. I found something much worse than a break-in, Gregory said. He opened a PDF of a document pulled from the county records office earlier that morning. It was a home equity line of credit, taken out against my estate exactly 3 weeks ago. The amount made my breath hitch in my throat, $110,000. I stared at the borrower's name, Madison Vance. My name. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page, written in ink that looked disturbingly like my own. 3 weeks ago, I was in London presenting a design proposal for a heritage site. I had the passport stamps and the airline data to prove I was 5,000 miles away from that piece of paper. This is identity theft, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal register. This is bank fraud. It gets colder, Gregory replied, pointing to the witness signature. Brian Vance. My father had not only witnessed the forgery, he had orchestrated the transaction. But it was the stamp next to the signature that felt like the final desecration. It was a notary seal belonging to my grandmother, a woman who had been a notary public for 40 years before her death last spring. They had stolen her seal from her estate before the funeral was even over. They had used the authority of the dead to mortgage my future to pay for their golden child's present. It was a multi-generational betrayal, calculated and bloodless. This is not a family misunderstanding, Madison, Gregory said, closing the laptop with a click that sounded like a prison door. This is a federal crime. 2 days later, the phone calls shifted from vitriol to a synthetic, forced reasonableness. Brian called, his voice no longer snarling but smooth. He said they wanted to smooth things over. He claimed Brandon had left expensive tools in my library and simply wanted to collect them. He even suggested they were willing to pay for the repairs if I dropped the charges. I agreed to meet them. I gave him the address of a building downtown, a space made of steel and floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the gray expanse of the Puget Sound. When they walked in, they did not look like criminals, they looked like board members. Brian, Julie, and Brandon walked in with confident, sweeping strides. Brandon was even smirking. He had brought Taylor with him, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. Brian sat at the head of the table, leaning back. "We are glad you finally came to your senses, Madison," he started. "This family is falling apart, and you're the only one who can fix it. We need $110,000 to cover Brandon's inconvenience and the legal fees you've cost us." I did not sit. I stood by the door and realized how much of their power had always been an illusion. They had the illusion of power only as long as their wallet, the people they exploited, remained open. The moment I revoked their access to my life, their status evaporated like fog. I slid a single piece of paper across the polished wood table. "What is this?" Brian asked. "It is the forensic audit of the equity line of credit," I said, my voice quiet but echoing in the absolute silence of the room. "The one Brandon took out in my name. The one you witnessed with a stolen notary seal." Brian went perfectly still. The smirk vanished from Brandon's face. "You forged my signature," I said, the words falling like lead. "You stole my identity. You committed bank fraud. That is not a family misunderstanding. That is a federal crime. In architecture, we remove the rot to save the structure. Today, I am finally clearing the site." At that moment, the door behind me opened. 2 detectives from the fraud unit walked in, their badges glinting under the clinical fluorescent lights. The room exploded. Brandon scrambled up, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, animal terror. "Dad, do something. Madison, tell them it is a mistake." But Brian could not do anything. He was staring at the handcuffs the detective was pulling from his belt. Brandon broke down into loud, ugly sobs, crying about his baby, about how he could not go to jail. My mother was screaming, calling me a traitor. I looked at Julie, who was sobbing into her manicured hands. I reached into my bag and pulled out a pamphlet I had picked up earlier. I slid it toward her. "What is this?" she gasped. "It is a pamphlet for low-income housing on the outskirts of the city," I said, my voice clinical. "You said family helps each other. I am helping you find a reality you can afford. You are going to need it once the bank forecloses on your house to pay for the restitution." I watched as the detectives led my father and brother away. I did not feel sad. I felt clean. It has been 6 months since I last saw my family in that conference room. 6 months of silence, and 6 months of peace. My library is finished now. I hired a new contractor, a man who respected the history of the house, and we rebuilt it better than before. The glass is triple-paned, designed to withstand the harsh Seattle winters. The floor is heated. I filled it with rare tropical plants, creating a living, breathing ecosystem that thrives under my care. It is a greenhouse in the truest sense, a place where I control the climate, where I decide what grows and what gets pruned. Brandon is currently serving a 3-year sentence in federal prison for bank fraud and identity theft. My parents lost their home. They had to sell it to pay for Brandon's legal defense and the restitution ordered by the court. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that they are renting a small apartment on the outskirts of town. I do not know the address, and I do not want to know. I deleted the contact group labeled family from my phone the day after the arrest. It was a small action, just a tap of a screen, but it felt like cutting an anchor loose. They are no longer a part of my digital landscape, just as they are no longer a part of my life. Sometimes late at night, I think about Taylor. I heard she moved back to her parents' house in Ohio. I hope she is okay. I hope she realizes that leaving was the bravest thing she could have done for her child. I saved her from a lifetime of being used, even if she hates me for how I did it. That is a burden I am willing to carry. I sit in my library now, drinking tea and watching the Seattle fog roll over the city. For years, I thought family was something you were born into, a debt you had to pay for the rest of your life. I thought love was a transaction and loyalty was an obligation. But as I look around at the life I have rebuilt, at the thriving plants, the restored walls, and the quiet stability, I realize the truth. Family is not biology. Biology is an accident, family is a choice. It is the people who respect your boundaries, who celebrate your success without jealousy, and who do not break into your home to steal your future. I had to let go of the bloodline to find myself. I had to cut the rot to save the tree. It was a painful surgery, and the scars are still there, hidden under fresh paint. But the tree is alive. It is growing. And for the first time in my life, its roots are deep and its branches are free. If you had to choose between your peace and your family's demands, which would you pick? Tell me in the comments. And do not forget to follow for more stories of justice.